answers will be here.
For a second, I was like, where's our closing?
Dude, focus. Patience. Okay.
Let's first talk about why renewable energy technology is so fundamentally important to, well, essentially saving our general interest at the end of the day, and why it's such an immediate concern for us before we go into the specific mechanics of this ocean investment, right? Why it's so important for government to pass on funds. So, why is it that renewable energy is so fundamentally important? Right? So, very simply speaking, where governments and companies engage in conventional kinds of, or utilize conventional energy such as fuel, oil-based, coal-based energy, then what you have is global warming in general, right? And that causes, in your global warming in general, it causes like climate change, which is what causes that an increase in natural disasters, which is what causes an increase as well as in domestic pollution, right? Which is why countries like China, which have generally been known to be rather selfish with their own economic interests, are also looking at ways to engage in renewable energy, right? Because they understand that this pollution is such a dire problem that is immediately and that has been immediately and urgently addressed, right? This also has like obviously far-reaching impacts. The Maldives are going to sink in a couple of years if we don't do anything about it, and if we don't start actively reversing this process, right? No one here is going to argue that climate change in general is very argue against the idea that climate change in general is very urgent problem that needs to be addressed, and that renewable energy is so important in addressing it, right? So moving on to the idea of why is it that conventional companies holding on to patents on renewable technology necessarily retards that process of coming up with renewable technology and also implementing this renewable technology, which is what my speech is sharing about. Moving on to that. Firstly, we start with the principle that if you, as a conventional company, are actively going against a social good, that in this case is the production of, is like climate change, renewable technology that fights against climate change actively, then your right to make profit can be sidelined. That's the principal stance that we're going against. Now I'm going to show you how those conventional companies holding on to these patents fundamentally retards the process of renewable technology being built in general. So let's talk about these conventional companies first and who these conventional companies largely are. Right? We're talking largely about conventional coal and oil companies. So we're talking about your British Petroleum, we're talking about your Shell and other companies that gain the majority of their profit from these conventional energy sources. So they gain it from like oil production and coal production. Right? So how does research in renewable energy work for these companies? Largely, they see that this is going to be something of the future. So they allocate it as a side interest. First, this isn't their primary interest, and they aren't interested in urgently creating renewable energy technologies, renewable energy technologies that are going to help you immediately and urgently. Right? They regard it largely as a side home because it isn't the bulk of where they get their profit from. So that's the first thing. What this means is that it's aside from the deprioritization of interest, it also means that they tend to engage in patent hoarding as well, right? And why is this? Because whenever they come up with the technology, they go on other conventional energy companies to catch up on the usage of that particular process as well, right? Which is why they tend to do patents on that process. The issue with this is that they largely engage in patent hoarding, and it creates a glut of patents because they don't have the interest to see these patents into fruition as actual renewable technology on the ground. So what they engage in essentially is patent hoarding. So the problem with that is that, and that's their perverse incentive in creating, in holding on to these renewable energy technologies, is that it means that companies that engage in this region, that they necessarily retard the progress of renewable energy development that is used by companies that engage primarily in renewable energy technology development. Right?
With your fuel price at an all-time low at this point in time, why would a companies like ExxonMobil or British Petroleum not utilize this to make eco-friendly products or vehicles?
Okay, so firstly, just because your fuel price is necessarily low doesn't mean that you're going to stop engaging in oil as your primary source of profit, right? That's just like, that's what these companies place a huge amount of their profit on. Why would they go away from or shift their priorities so dramatically into renewable energy just because the fuel prices are at an all-time low? Also, regarding fuel prices, those things necessarily tend to fluctuate wildly, right? At one point, they hit like rock bottom and just a few years from then, they are at an all-time high. It means that they aren't going to change their long-term goals just because the fuel prices are low, because those things the prices tend to fluctuate. So it means that we have to rely on the bulk of this renewable energy being produced by companies that primarily engage in renewable energy development. Like we're talking about companies like like Tesla Motors. We're talking about like companies like that Spanish renewable company that's doing some important work in India right now. We're talking about these companies that largely view renewable energy development as their primary source of profit, instead of these conventional energy companies that view it as a side project that would probably in the long run accrue them some kind of profit. Right? So what does it mean so how does this negatively affect these primary companies? Obviously, because there is a cost of payments, they can't continue to develop their renewable energy technologies, and they also can't put it on the ground because they have to pay out of their mouth out of their nose for it. So that essentially means that these companies and their pursuits in engaging renewable energy development are fundamentally retarded. So how does this negatively affect your situation on the ground? Madam Speaker, let's take a look at how governments engage in utilizing renewable energy technology. Largely, these governments. So let's take the Clean Power Plan under the Environmental Protection Agency by Obama, right? Which plans to remove like 870 million tons of carbon dioxide by 2030. So when these federal governments are given these just like huge owners and then they delegate it to the state governments, how they engage in this kind of thing isn't by primarily conducting that research themselves, but by essentially outsourcing it to these these private companies that largely engage in renewable energy technology, ones that are interested in helping them immediately and urgently. Right? So the problem then is that when they are outsourcing to these companies can't come up with the immediate and urgent solutions that are necessary for them to have something to sell to these governments, because there is that latent blood going on that I talked to you earlier about. So that means that your governments, even if they do have the funds allocated, the funds necessary to do this, to engage in clean energy measures, can't do so because there isn't that technology necessary, and these companies can't produce it for them. It also means that in the future there's a problem because the barriers to entry for small research, for small companies that are coming up and engaging in this kind of research is also fundamentally retarded. For all these reasons, we back this.
Can you clarify this speech? I will give it sorry about that there. We now join the legal proposition.
SEC government has a pretty intuitive case. They tell us that the environment is dying, they tell us that hoarding is bad. We agree that these arguments might work 10 years ago, but in the current context that we're talking about, where oil prices is all-time low, and there's already naturally an incentive to produce green technology, and there's already naturally an incentive for you to market these products up anyways, because now the prime time for you to capitalize on renewable technology, then the debate really is about who best utilizes the spaces and who should allow them to be helped by. 3 arguments for me today. Number 1, I'll give a basic knowledge of initiative and why some government don't really necessarily understand fundamentals of it. Secondly, I'll tell you who exactly can utilize the R&D and why is it that only when conventional energy companies with big capitals own it, that essentially is a collective good for everyone. And thirdly, I'll talk more or less about the alternative that they don't want you to hear when you allow that motion to go through. But before that, several points for rebuttal that don't fit into the arguments, right? Firstly, they say that, well, basically they consider that even China, the biggest polluter, that we have said so far are already looking for green tech alternatives. What this concession means is that naturally, even if, for example, you do allow the conventional energy companies to hold patents, they will always be incented over it. That's why in status quo, where energy companies are allowed to hold patents, they are already, Tesla is emerging the own technology, a lot of renewable energy popping up in, like, for example, African countries and also European countries, so we don't see a problem with that. Secondly, they say, well, when a corporation actively goes against social good, they should be sidelined. No, no, no. The government never had the obligation to hold the moral high ground when it comes to this kind of thing. In order for you to prove harm, it has to be actual harm. For example, the product killing someone by accident, negligence on your part. Those things are never existent here. For example, we can argue that they're providing a benefit by allowing your cars and your motorcycles to move with the fuel that they provide. So the yardstick that we actually draw here is since when do we actually go against that? But we don't see that even, for example, when markets really like hots up the price and increase the price of essential medicines that are included in the British days, the government can't do shit, right? And we say in those instances there are far dire worse harms compared to these instances that we don't believe, and I'm going to tell you later on why it's a good thing. But thirdly, they say, well, they're going to hoard the patents forever. Hello, patents have a timeline. That means more often than not, your patent can only last for 10 years at the maximum. That means there's an opportunity cost for these companies to actually make use of the very high exorbitant fees for you to apply for this patent and make sure that they do actually commercialize the product at the end of the day. There's no profit incentive company on your side that wants to earn profit, but suddenly you will spend millions of dollars actually holding patents and not doing shit about it. But lastly, they say, well, why would we ask them PUI, if they want to profit, then why not now when oil prices low? They say, well, they want to drop their primary interest. There's a reason why they're not called oil and gas companies, they're called energy companies. That means ultimately it's still about sustenance. That means they are ready to make the shift anytime the market is there. We tell you market right now is that there's already a good market for green tech. For example, we can see like Tesla emerging, but even without that, like automotive companies, for example, like Mitsubishi and Toyota are already building more and more hybrid cars. So we tell you there's already a market ready for them to take. And essentially, Hari in his last minute tells us about creating barriers and somehow people can access it. We don't necessarily understand how maybe the DPM actually do a better job of that. We can engage with that as well. But let's go on into my case. Firstly, our stance is really simple. The burden that we have to prove on site in negative is to just show you on the comparative outside holds better promises, and ultimately we are the ones that do better for renewable technology as a whole. And with that, let's move into it. What are we okay with? We're okay with status quo. What we can improve on status quo is this. We have more proper enforcement of patent laws. That means we prevent unnecessary evergreening, and we make sure that the evergreening process, if they want to renew their patents and hoard out, like what they say, has to be through legitimate causes, and we believe that it's more than possible for the government to do that. Right. Let's move into the patent sheet. My first argument on patent sheet. Ultimately, you have to understand what's the intent of people actually holding patent sheet. The very simple answer to this is for profit margin. If we agree on both sides that it's profit margin, then we have to understand what do they do with this patent. We pay more or less is to protect their own interest and to actually have R&D into it. And why exactly is this R&D important? Recognize that more often than not when we talk about research and development, you need a lot of capital, especially when we talk about frontier technologies like establishing new source of energy. It involves a lot of money. We believe more than not when you have small companies of like established small companies coming out with this green technology is number one, very hard for them to continue, and therefore your R&D will more often than not stop prematurely. But secondly, they'll be bought up by these big companies anyways, right, later on. So why not allow them to just immediately do that? We see that in all forms of industries, basically. In the pharmaceutical industries, Novartis and Pfizer don't come up with 99% of the drugs that they make. Ultimately, they're all independent drug makers who do that, and understanding that they have more capital than R&D, the drug company collectively allow them to do it because ultimately they recognize that if your product just stops prematurely in the research and development processes, no one brings any benefit from it. That's why we tell you that the opportunity cost is there. Ultimately, we already told you that there is a high fee when it comes to applying for this form of partnership. That's why eventually they will want to commercialize the market because ultimately it's what's good for them, and we agree that their profits much. I'll take it in a while. But also, let's talk about the market trend. Why is it that they will not hard right now? Essentially, the debate happens in the current context where there's already a general consensus that the earth is going to shit. It's not as if when there are soothsayers or there are doomsday scientists saying that we're going to die soon and they will still hold on to it and not release it. We tell you the debate is about who can best utilize the short transition time between oil and gas and also renewable energy to make full use of it. We say oil and gas companies are in the best position to actually combat technology stars of emerging and providing you the best green technology when it's released. And that's why we tell you the oil and gas companies already do this. For example, we see the ExxonMobil is already contributing like the biggest source of energy, wind energy in Holland. Petron is involved in geothermal energy in Iceland. These are all, for example, instances to show you that they don't like mindlessly hold on to just wanting to provide oil and gas, and they are more ready to not want to shift.
If oil and gas companies are right now suffering from low oil prices, that means that this is literally the worst time for them to be able to make the capital necessary for them to produce.
No. If oil and gas is at an all-time low, that means even if they manage to sell a lot of quantity of that, like simple market economists will tell you that they can't make much benefit from it anyway. And telling you that oil is a finite resource that eventually it will run out. There's an incentive on behalf of these companies to start making the transition. Second argument, who best utilizes this R&D? We already tell you, more than enough, the parallel with pharmaceuticals, there's incentive for them to ensure that sustenance of these companies go on. They understand that oil is a finite resource and therefore they will try to make the transition as quick as possible. But thirdly, let's look at what's the alternative that we have. One thing that some government don't want to understand that there's another legal avenue for them to actually do it if they don't allow them to patent. They can market it in a legal way called a trade secret. What does this mean? That means companies like Coca-Cola and Pepsi are legally allowed to withhold information from that. Why is this important? Understanding that patent, even the only thing that prevents you from doing when you have a patent is marketing those products. It does not inhibit you from knowing how they manage to come up with the product. Therefore, the process that is involved in the making and manufacturing of those products are still regulated to legal. That means resources and research can still be done by other companies even if you hold a product. And that's one key piece of information that you cannot allow government to steal away from. Ultimately, the debate is about who can best utilize those papers. We tell you that it's only when you allow oil and gas companies to make full use of it with their huge capital, then we can actually reap the benefits together. Very proud of folks.
Thank you for the speech and otherwise. Deputy Prime Minister, here
This debate is ultimately about three things. Number one, how do we ensure that renewable energy can be put into production in the near future, given that Hari has already enumerated a number of harms of doing so. Number two, how do we maximize the adoption of renewable energy in the long term? And number three, in a world whose economics are already messed up by large oil companies that control the energy markets, how do we then ensure that we have a more stable energy production in the future? So let's first talk about the thing that Elo talked about, which completely stand out from my direct clashes with him. So firstly, this whole idea that the harm is not sufficient to legally mandate or ban on that. We think that this is an extremely low burden for operating upon, and they really need to show us why that's a good start for government to take in this case, when they're not really showing us that in the future. Secondly, the idea that patents don't last forever. Honestly, if even for 10 years, a renewable energy company can hold a patent that would otherwise have been used by a smaller company, put into production a large number of windmills that could reduce the renewable energy that's necessary to save the environment. We think that that's a necessary benefit that they ignore on their side. That means 10 years, potentially more of renewable energy being produced on our side. So let's clash with them firstly on this whole idea of fuel prices being low. I already pointed out from my point of information to the previous speaker that if oil prices are low, that means that the corporations that produce oil are currently suffering. They're finding it hard to make profits of their own. This is precisely the worst time for them, in their own eyes, as profit-incentivized companies, to be investing a large amount of money into producing renewable energy products, such as they're not going to invest huge amounts into producing windmills at this time. But secondly, this is something that's already been characterized by Hari, that OPEC as a bloc is already fighting towards ensuring that the oil prices do increase in the short run. We already see the progression towards that being made in terms of their policy. We think it's something that happens over a long period of time as well. Oil prices have been shown to fluctuate, and it's very likely that they're going to rise again. And the moment they do rise again, that's when it becomes incredibly profitable for these oil companies to continue to be relying on oil, as opposed to going into renewable energy that is not going to be as profitable for them in the future. So based on those premises, let's talk about the incentives of large companies in first terms. We see that they have a perverse incentive to block out any sort of competition in the energy market altogether, because energy is something that needs to be considered as one large block as well. If you have a large amount of coal or oil being produced renewable energy, then the renewable energy that comes about as a result of windmills or solar panels is necessarily competition that crowds out a market which they ultimately control in today's day and age. We think that ultimately, since they don't have an incentive to themselves go and produce that, they have an incentive to hold patents that prevent anyone from accessing that industry so that they can continue to perpetuate the monopolies that they have been doing so in the past as well. We think that this is incredibly harmful, especially people that does leave an incentive for them to hold patents and then prevent other small companies from rising up and taking up those voids in energy by producing more renewable energy sources and ultimately ensuring that we have more renewable energy in the future. Before I move on, okay.
Sir, if conventional energy companies want to run a competition among smaller companies, can't they already do it under one side with lobbying as well?
Okay. Number one, if lobbying exists and you consider that as an extremely large harm, then we think that that's something that's much worse on your side, especially since you can lobby against companies by showing, you don't only have lobbying as power, but you also have the ability to shut out small companies who try to innovate in that sector by saying we already hold a patent in this and you can't really move into it anyway. We think that if lobbying is such a harmful thing and you see corporation interest as something that's harmful, then you can see a lot of the harms that we are talking about in terms of large oil companies having a purpose incentive to then ensure that renewable energy doesn't come up in the future. We think that that was a major concession by the leader in that. So let's first talk about adoption of renewable energy, because this is the argument that Babi made about barriers to entry that they didn't understand on their side and refused to deal with. We see that large companies ultimately do have an incentive to shut out competition. They do have the ability to do so as well, not just through lobbying, but under status quo through patents as well. This means that if they hold a patent for some sort of renewable energy technology, let's say they hold some sort of patent on some process of converting tidal energy into electricity, we think that it's impossible for any other company to go and try to research into such a similar process as well, especially because patents have been shown to be so easily like read in different ways that it's very easy to then use the lobbying power of a large corporation to say that you're violating patent rules as a small company and you can't really put this into production, and that ultimately hurts those small companies. But seeing this as a barrier in the end, seeing that this is something that large companies can do in addition to lobbying power that they already have, we think that further increases the barriers to entry that you have to entering that sort of renewable energy sector in the first place, especially because these smaller companies will then see no incentive to move into those sectors and research into those sectors because they can't really put it into production and then make a profit out of it in the future if large energy companies shut them out. We see that that is extremely harmful, especially because in the short term, that means small companies that are actively doing research and trying to produce renewable energy in the current status quo are not being able to do so because they're being shut out by large oil companies in the first place. Before I move on, are there any other things? So lastly, let's talk about the economics of it. So let's talk about how oil companies ultimately control a large portion of the economy and how the world functions as well. We see that having a few large players in energy harms the world on a few levels. Number one, they firstly come from largely developed countries. And secondly, their ability to manipulate oil prices ultimately means that they can manipulate the economy of these countries at any point in time as well. There's a fundamental difference when it comes to this and renewable energy. The first thing is that renewable energy, unlike sources like oil, aren't constrained to a few countries, which means that they can be put into production in a large number of countries around the world who will ultimately be able to gain a stake into the energy sector in the end. What happens then when a large oil company retards the production of renewable energy from another country within their own as well? You completely shut out the potential of the creation of a renewable energy market from a country like China or India that are doing research into producing things like windmills in the air. That ultimately means that if you have a patent for some sort of windmill and China tries to produce something similar and put it into production sooner, that can be ultimately shut out by a large energy company from reaching other countries around the world as well. We think that that ultimately means that an energy monopoly that is created as a result of oil in today's day and age is ultimately perpetuated and kept in the end. We think that large oil companies there are going to continue to hold major patents on energy altogether and continue to hold that monopoly on energy. That ultimately means that they can control the economy of the world in the way that they've been doing so and ultimately shut out other countries from bringing any other production in the end. So what have we ultimately clashed with on our side opposition? Number one, we've shown you that patents are a tool which are used by large companies to ultimately shut out any form of small companies coming into the energy sector and try to develop renewable energy sources that will help us adopt renewable energy much sooner and ensure that we save the environment much sooner. We think that that affects the environment on a fundamental level and also affects the economy of the world in the end. For all these reasons, we propose.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for his speech and I invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Here. point, Madam Chair, I think the debate will boil down to the issue of whether conventional energy companies are willing to invest, commercialize, and research into renewable energy. And probably this issue will decide this debate. So I'll go straight into this issue. Madam Chair, there are a lot of characterizations that we can give corporations. Some are nice, some are not so much. But the fundamental principle is that they are not evil, they are just profit-oriented. Based on that metric, we'll tell you why we win this debate. Let's compare this. There's no incentive to invest and to commercialize because one is a lack of urgency, people want to hoard, and if you shut out competition, then you get more money. We tell you why that's not true. One, oil price is not just a random argument that we're able to throw you. We can give you numbers and stats of massive companies like Shell and BP, or even smaller companies who subsist on loans, who invested into shale gas, which are shutting down in the US, and even big companies are having to lay off their workers. That means even though they still have the money to buy patents, they are forced into a position where they have to look for alternatives because as the oil price has no sign of returning and recovering in the near future, they have to look for alternatives for their own sustenance. But number two, market trends, right? We think consumerism, no thank you, move towards a more conscientious model. That means politicians and the younger people nowadays are very environmental conscious. And in fact, environment is something that's talked about in every presidential campaign. We think then that's why the market trend exists, that a lot of young people want to buy things such as Tesla's electric cars, and that's why those things are already gaining traction, which means there is a market for oil companies to tap into, even in renewable energy. But lastly, when we asked about the time limit of patents, it was important because there's no point in these companies investing millions and millions into buying those patents, which will expire anyway in 10 years, and let them sit there and do nothing. To maximize profit, that means these companies will have to commercialize, will have to research, and have to put out these products out onto the market. So we're happy with laws that prevent evergreening, for example, but fundamentally, patents have to exist first to ensure that companies have the capacity and the incentive to research and to commercialize. So on this issue of whether companies will want to commercialize or whether companies will want to sell renewable energy, we think we take innovation. Yes.
Ultimately, if you want to make a shift from oil to renewable energy, it requires you pulling out a lot of the resources that you've already invested in oil and pour them into renewable energy. That is the kind of capital that they don't have when they're losing profits under your market.
They are, if they are, well, okay, so this is another issue, right? So, but let's address it directly. So, a lot of companies are shutting down, but they are not the companies that we're talking about in this debate because they don't have the money to buy patents. And we're talking about the huge MNCs, corporations like Shell and ExxonMobil and BP, who are still sustaining, although losing profits, still have the ability to already invest in all the patents that they talk about, right? So, what do these companies do? We think that for them to succeed, they then have to commercialize like what I talked about. So let's talk about the second issue. So Patrick talked to you about why companies will have the incentive to research. I'll talk to you about post-release of green tech, how we make the world a better place in helping the transition, right? So when the POI was, you have to pull out a lot of resources and invest it into commercializing, invest it into renewable energy. Those are profits that are already lost anyway. How would companies want to recover those losses that they already made under the oil price crisis? One, we think oil and gas companies or fossil fuel companies are in a much better position to commercialize green tech. One, because they reduce the initial pushback of tapping into an entirely new market. If you're a new startup green energy company, the initial pushback is immensely huge in terms of tapping into a new market, in terms of creating the networks, creating the infrastructures and logistics, which you don't have. At least if you're a fossil fuel company, you already have that kind of market relations with people. But secondly, you have the capital to market, the capacity to market your stuff and to commercialize it so that the common layman can access it. Thirdly, it's about market replacement, right? Currently, they want to shut out competition because they want to monopolize. But when they themselves are profiting from green tech, they will have no incentive to shut out those kind of new developments because all the profits go back to them. But fourthly, it's also about branding. As opposed to some random brand that I see on a car that says green tech or green leaf or like Everlife, I won't have as much incentive or trust as opposed to seeing a brand such as BP or ExxonMobil or like conventional car companies have more trust in buying those green tech. But lastly, it's also about lobbying. It's also about the international monopoly, the thing that Avinash talked about in his argument. Yes, companies have the incentive to shut out competition. That's why they lobby against green tech. That's why they have this international monopoly thing going on. But the thing is this, they cannot or they don't want to lobby against themselves. Why would they have the incentive to go into Congress and say shut down and block all the incentives to create green technology? Because now it doesn't hurt their profit anymore. We think that's a huge benefit because if you are able to remove that kind of pushback from congressional lobby, from like manipulation of powers, we think that's a good thing. It's actually helping the like commercialization of green tech, right? But lastly, I also like briefly talk about the sustenance of oil companies. Currently, it's not just these oil companies that are in trouble. It's also a lot of oil-producing nations who are in trouble and are not making money out of this oil crisis. When you allow these oil companies to profit from green tech and to help them commercialize green tech, that contributes to the general economic well-being. You reduce the oil fluctuations. You at least stabilize major like national-owned companies, for example, Petronas in Malaysia. That helps these oil-producing companies to be more stable in their economies. Lastly, what's the comparative? If you do not allow conventional fossil fuel companies to hold patents, like what Patrick told you, they can turn to not patent these things, but only turn them into trade secrets, which means we're not able to have any information about those things at all. That's bad. Secondly, if you don't allow them to patent, they will have no incentive to fund research, which at least they right now do. Thirdly, there will be lesser commercialization of green tech because there are not as many huge companies out there who have the capacity and capital like Shell and ExxonMobil does. Lastly, it affects economic stability, and for all these reasons, we're extremely helpful.
I've ended the particular opposition for the speech, and now I'm like, something with the other.
Madam Speaker, it was pretty clear right from everybody's speech that your big energy companies, your conventional energy companies, are the bad guys who are causing climate change. Because of their large-scale commercial interests, because of the amount of money that they have already invested into oil and gas, into these commercial interests that are spread out all across the world, they don't have the right kind of incentives. They are not in the best position. They are not the best people that we want in our society to invest in renewable energy. We do not want these companies with these conflicting interests to be the champions for renewable energy because A, it doesn't make sense to us, and most importantly, B, it doesn't make sense to them, right? So this flies in the face of everything that some opposition wanted to characterize about them, that they are benevolent, that these big companies have lots of money, that oh no, they're dying out because of the oil price has gone down, and they are therefore going to suddenly invest in renewable energy. We haven't seen that happen yet. We don't think that is ever going to happen, right? I'm going to show you why whatever incentive that they have is firstly perverse, and even if not, unlikely to achieve the kind of change that we want, for the kind of positive change that we want to see in the world energy market today. Two things that we want to highlight from this debate. Firstly, the incentives for energy companies. Secondly, the impacts of patents on the renewable energy industry. Firstly, let's talk about the incentives of these energy companies. We're going to show you why they don't have their hearts in the right places. First, on the first step, right? Because their primary profit making, they primarily derive profit from the oil and gas industry. How? By maintaining the supply and demand for oil and gas, right? Supply in terms of having these operations in all across the world, right? Holding these resource-rich countries captive because of their resource extraction operations, and at the same time manipulating prices by keeping it down, by forming cartels and all that, which is the reason why prices are fluctuate the way they do in the first place. Right? Why do they do this? Because that's the most sustainable way for these big companies, these big giants, to earn money, right? Even if they choose to diversify in many different industries, we think they are never going to move away from their primary practice. So what, right? So this actually means that they are never going to actually change, right? They'll always go back to their primary interest, which is in sustaining a strong and vibrant oil and gas industry. Right, through lobbies, through maintaining through lobbies, through cartels, through manipulating prices and all that. Right. Secondly, right, the impact of low oil prices on these oil companies. Right. Firstly, they tried to show you, Mrs. Panel Speaker, that oil companies are in trouble. No, they are not. Right. Just because your oil companies are laying off their employees, just because they're going through major restructuring, just because they are not making as much profits as before, it doesn't mean that these small companies are necessarily going to go anywhere anytime soon. Right? We think that we have seen these fluctuations happen in the past, right? We think this is part of the business cycle. They'll definitely be back again. Why? Because the oil and gas supplies themselves are not going anywhere, right? Even if, right, we say that they're desperate enough to change tack, right, to want to go into a different industry, they can't because of their conflicting interests, right? The fact is that your oil generators that you provide oil to, right, cannot be used to suddenly take in wind energy that you want to sell because you change your entire company, right? We think that that their entire argument on how they're able to market and make use of their existing networks and all this to suddenly sell hydro energy rather than wind energy, rather than fossil fuel energy is unlikely to happen, right? Because of the very fact that these networks, these resources are not translatable from one industry to another. Right? What's likely to happen is that, in fact, right, these companies are likely to simply co-opt the renewable energy patents, renewable energy campaigns, and in order to seem like they're doing something, to seem like they are hedging their bets, to seem like they are expanding their portfolio of energy sources, while at the same time not actually doing enough to push these renewable energies to the forefront of the energy industry, which is what we want to achieve on site government today, right? So that's the reason, and in fact that's the reason why they are less likely to interfere in Congress, because once they have the patents in their pockets, once they have these interests as part of their umbrella of subsidiaries and services, they are unlikely to oppose legislation in Congress, because it still feeds into their own interests anyway. Yes.
So under your best case scenario, where these patents will exist, even if small companies are able to get the green tech out, what's stopping all companies from drawing them out? What do focus?
Yeah, the fact is, like, because they are no longer able to patent these technologies, right? They are unable to take over this industry and then to use those resources to prioritize oil and gas, and which is the primary problem that we've already posed to you today. On the second issue, the impacts of patents on the renewable energy industry. On the first level, because we think that the current system actually hurts small companies. So as we've already explained, the amount of lobbying and bullying that results from the use and abuse of patents of patent complaints and violations as legal action is the very reason why other status quo, they are actually able to buy up all these patents, to bully these small companies, to oppose legislation in Congress that's against their favor and instead in the favor of other recent renewable energy companies, right? Even if we already shown you that even if they stop their lobbying, right? Even if they stop their lobbying, it's only because they've already co-opted those interests, because they've already eliminated that competition, right? What do we want to achieve for you, Madam Speaker, today? On the second level is that we want to grow an industry from the ground up. We want to take those resources, take the amount of money that the government has, and drive demand for renewable energy technologies that come from companies that don't have that confidence, that come from the small companies that can access a whole wide range of funding that will make available to them. Because we want to see change that takes place now instead of later. So even if you say best case scenario, these big companies form up the renewable energy industry, we think it'll be too slow, too far off in the future by then long.
And the government which seeks to by opposition. Hear them.
Corporations are profit-driven. That is something that was echoed throughout all speakers on the government. Yes, we consider profit-driven. And yes, of course, they profit from oil and gas, which is their niche market at this point in time. But do they still profit from oil and gas? That is a question that opposition brought to the reality and the context that's happening in status quo. Because there is a reason why your big companies like Shell and Petronas are cutting over 38% of your workforce. That includes your oil and gas engineers and also major workers that contribute to these sectors. There's a reason why they are getting hit more than half of the GDP in profit growth. It is because the price of oil is shit at this point in time, which is why they are suffering so much in that aspect. But why are they doing research in patent? Because some things like government misconstrued is that these people want to research patent. But in fact, they already have this patent and they're doing research in it. If they are, why would they spend so much money doing this patent if their existing business is already going down? That is a question that was not answered by side government. In my speech, I'll talk about three things. First, would these companies change and go green? Because that's the biggest contest that they push to us. Secondly, even in any case, what's best for R&D, which side is that? And third, and most importantly, Deborah's point, which was not engaged, the transitioning from a non-renewable source to a renewable source, right? First thing, would companies change and go green? Let's talk about these companies and the trend on which they transition, right? And whether or not they will adapt to surroundings and changes in society. 80 years ago, when cars first started out, these vehicles started off with coal. They used hard coal in terms of manufacturing the way they do. And then they moved on to black crude oil. And when trends started shifting into the light of pollution-free environment, which is when these companies started innovating their existing crude oil to produce fuel that was that was more environment friendly and caused less pollution. This was trends of companies willing to change their niche market in developing their existing product to suit the current trend in status quo, right? Let's look at what's happening right now at this day night. Oil prices is going down and oil is running up. These are two of the problems that Patrick painted in his leader of opposition speech. And he also gives you examples of these companies willing to shift to in that direction. ExxonMobil and Shell provides kiosks or displays to charge your electrical cars in their petrol stations, both in Belgium and Netherlands. These are existing status quos of trends which shows that these companies are willing to shift from these oil areas to renewable sources areas. Even the example of cars, vehicle producers like Mitsubishi, etc., producing electrical cars. These are trends that show these companies are willing to change towards a more positive trend. Like if that is what gives them profit, sit down. They never once contested on our paradigm that these companies are losing profit based on their oil and gas business at this point in time. But why is that incentive for them to change? All they said is they will never change because it's a conflict of interest. But the thing is, it will no longer be a conflict of interest if they start profiting from renewable energy as well. That was a possibility that this side never wanted to engage on, right? Because yes, we agree that this is a contentious issue on whether or not they will change or not. But at least that opposition provides you trend analysis to show that they are willing to adapt. Because if what everyone says is true and all they want is profit, the profit right now and the biggest in thing right now is renewable energy sources, which is why they're spending so much money in researching it, and which is why they need to have this patent, because there they want to transition it into products and sell it and market it to the public, right? Second issue, what's best for R&D? This will engage this whole small companies argument, maybe in a while, right? On higher innovation, etc. Because they first argued that hoarding occurs on our side because the companies don't want to sell out this patent. But we will argue that hoarding only occurs on their side when you disallow these corporations from having patents to begin with. Why is this the case? Because these companies will still want to do research and they still want to explore into the field of renewable energy because that is a future niche area that they want to go into, right? So what happens then? Why is patent better than no patent? When you have a patent, you have to reveal the contents, the ingredients, or the mechanism involved in producing this particular product, which is why you patent it and then publish it to the world. If anyone were to copy it, then you can take a legal action against them. That is the beauty of patent. What happens when you disallow them to patent? This was the argument that both of our speakers talked about trade secrets. If you don't allow them to patent, they will still further research on these areas. It's just that now no one will know what this is renewable energy made out of, and etc. Right? Because even if you want to talk about smaller companies, yes, we do agree to a larger extent. Your small companies are important, but these are also your companies that lack expertise, lack capital. They can never venture into this renewable energy, which is why existing patents. That even if you draw a parallel to drugs and etc. The reason why generic drugs even exist is because of these patents that are out for these people to look at and to add more ingredients to create generic drugs that helps with antiretroviral drugs in places like Africa, for instance. Sit down. I think you.
Okay. The argument that you brought out on trade secrets, number one, is new in your speech. But number two, even if these trade secrets aren't really that big a deal because production of renewable energy things like windmills and energy are quite common knowledge and are research income by other people than these companies well.
Number one, trade secrets is not a new argument, it was in Patrick's case and also Deborah's speech. Secondly, trade secrets is worse under your side. Because an example of trade secrets is Coke's recipe to your Coca-Cola, right? There's a reason why no one knows what's in it, because they never patented it. Because there's only 2 people in the world that knows the ingredient to it. The harm of that is that no one can ever know how you're going to venture or do more research or innovate further to this existing drugs on this existing thing. Third and most importantly, in terms of transitioning from non-renewable to renewable. Why is transitioning better under our side? Because we would argue to you that it's like in status quo, even when you already have renewable sources, renewable energy and products, the reason why they're more turned down by the other products is because your non-renewable sources are cheaper and are more accessible and they're less marketed by your bigger corporations. Now that you also allow these big corporations to also venture into this and also market this, which is when you no longer have a competition between renewable and non-renewable, which is when these products will be more marketable and better commercialized by these people. Because you're more likely to buy a product that's from Honda than a random company name, blah, 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 right? Because this is just the trends and the mindset of people. This is something that Deborah talked about in her speech, that was not really tackled under their side. Because if you really want renewable energy to be out there, the only way to do it is if it is transitioned by companies that have the capital, the expertise, and the marketing ability to put this product out there. At the end of the day, Madam Chair, we argue, yes, that corporations are profit-driven. But the profit right now that they can get the most out of is the renewable energy, which is why we want them to keep these papers and further venture into it.
Yeah. Thank you, opposition whip, speech and now invite the opposition whip.
Well, companies have done a lot of horrible things against green tech in the past in the name of profit. They have produced papers claiming that global warming is not man-made. When Al Gore proposed a green GDP that measures environmental pollution, ExxonMobil lobbied fiercely against it to stop it in Congress. When they lobbied for the building of the Yellowstone pipeline and the rights to drill in the Arctic, all those in the name of profit. Some oil companies later on found out that this form of blocking out competition might not be very sustainable for them. So they got smarter and they thought maybe we can produce green tech as well. And so we have companies like Petron that monopolizes geothermal energy production in Iceland. We have Shell that produces wind energy in Holland. This is a concession, in fact, by, I think, Prime Minister that says these are side businesses that these oil companies already do anyway. We think the worst thing that can happen right now when companies are trying to transition into that kind of more sustainable and more profiting model where the market exists, the worst thing you can tell is that oil and gas companies, that green tech will always be a threat to you, and you better stay on the dark side because there's nothing that you can do. You cannot ever profit from green tech, so you cannot venture into this. We think that's harmful because as long as conflicting interests remain conflicting interests, there will always be incentive for huge MNCs to drown out smaller green tech companies, to drown out in terms of lobbying, in terms of marketing strategies, for example. So the best case under their side is this. Probably there will be a lot of maybe smaller companies who are able to produce green technology, but either one, they don't have the capacity to commercialize those technology, or two, they cannot sell it and no one can buy it. That means they got drowned out. That profits or benefits no one. In the end, we think that's highly harmful. But then we argue, suppose we allow conflicting interests to become to work hand in hand for these oil companies. That means now you can benefit from these things. There are huge benefits to this. One, you immediately reduce the initial pushback that a lot of green tech companies will face in lobbying, for example, because now Petron and ExxonMobil will stop lobbying against green tech. That's good for not just the bigger companies, but also the smaller companies as well. We argue to you that when you patent information, for example, at least if you cannot produce things out of those information, you can study those research. You can study what Petron and ExxonMobil has already done, and you can improve on that. And we think research is not a zero-sum game. Just because you produce some research doesn't mean you block out other people from doing the same thing. But also other benefits, such as a lot that we talked about in Patrick's speech and in my speech, the ability to use your capital to venture into more research and more development. Your ability to commercialize this also. The ability, when you already have the existing networking in the market, where you already have the branding and people already trust you, you don't have the incentive to shut out competition anymore because you yourself hold the profit to those things. We think in that role, it is much better because at the end, commercialization, green tech is not just about producing and the research, it's also about getting it out there. This debate has to be who is able to allow more people to use green tech, because ultimately this is something that can only win if enough people transition from fossil fuel and oil and gas into green tech. Only then can we do something to save the environment. And that's when we think we really win this argument. But we showed you that there is an incentive for companies to venture into renewable energy because of market demand and because of oil prices and because of their capacity. But secondly, we told you in the post-release of green tech world, we do it much better. We're very happy to do this.
I have explained the opposition reply to the speech, and now invite the slide. You're here.
I'm going to analyze this debate on two issues. Number one, do oil companies have an incentive to tap into renewable energy and then make that a large part of their profit-making calculus? And second, are these companies the best people to go into renewable energy? Something that Bob really wanted to drop on their side, which came out from my speech and from my speech as well. So let's first talk about oil companies' incentives. We brought you three arguments here. Number one, that oil remains more lucrative than renewable energy for these companies. We showed you this because they already have a huge market for oil, billions of dollars invested into oil plants, oil refineries, and like drills around the world. And ultimately, they have to shut down and then reinvest a lot of money into windmills and things like that if they want to tap into renewable energy. We think that that is an extremely huge cost for them, especially in the times when oil prices are low, like Bob wanted to talk about. But secondly, we think that energy exists as one large market in the end, because if a renewable energy company does come up and takes up a part of the energy of one country, we think that that ultimately is competition to the energy companies themselves, especially because they want to keep control over those sectors of energy as well. Given Hari's premise then, that countries like China are also heavily invested in green tech and really want that to come about, ultimately, if a new company wants to set up a plant in China, that's going to be harmed when they don't have when the patent of a large company prevents them from doing so as well. We think that that is something that they ignored on that side. But ultimately, based on these two premises, the only reason a large oil company would want to pay anything on renewable energy is to prevent these smaller companies from accessing that technology in the first place and ensuring that other governments buy that technology and bring it up as we ultimately wanted in the end. So what did Bob say in the end? So if oil prices are low, this gives them an incentive to transition into renewable energy. And number two, these companies may invest people to bring about this renewable energy change because they have like some sort of large capital which they can invest into it. And last on this argument on trade secrets. So number one, on the balance of probabilities, we already been the point that it's far less likely that these companies will invest in renewable energy when they already have such a huge stake in the non-renewable energy market, when oil is such a huge part of the profits that they make, and ultimately that is a price that oil prices are probably going to rise in the near future as well. And we think that that remains a large stake in that profit. But ultimately, on the balance as well, it's extremely large investment for them to move away from oil, and that's something that these companies are very unlikely to do. So we win that argument. But secondly, let's talk about trade secrets and how they can prevent innovation in that. Number one's argument was only fully elaborated in Leverett speech and shouldn't be given credit. But secondly, if we talk about these trade secrets, they are going to be like Coke's formula, which nobody was about. Ultimately, a lot of research is happening with renewable technology, not just by these companies, but by governments and by smaller companies as well. We think that when you patent a process, something like process for turning tidal energy into electricity, ultimately any company that's smaller and might have researched into a similar process won't be able to put that in production because the companies that are large companies will be able to prevent them from doing so under those patents. But lastly, this is the even if, which is something that they didn't really deal with on their side. Even if energy companies do produce more renewable energy and help solve global, help to ensure there's more renewable energy in the short term, we show you on our side why these companies are the worst people to control the renewable energy markets, which is something that they conceded to as well. Because even Deborah in the reply speech up to now said that large oil companies are the worst people to have power over energy, especially because they are the ones who firstly ruin the environment and control large monopolies within energy as well. This undermines any argument that we bring about these companies deserving patents in the future. But secondly, they mess up the world economy when monopolies are perpetuated even further, because they already have a monopoly over the energy market that is ultimately hurting the ability of economies like China and India from tapping into energy markets as well. We think that when you take away that monopoly from them, by not allowing the patent technology that allows the rise of more companies within these countries, ultimately then we allow these economies to rise beyond the monopolies that are created by these oil companies. For all these reasons, we take this.
Because